May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across America, church bells rang out in triumph while crowds flooded the streets in jubilant celebration. In prisoner of war camps scattered from California to Maine, German soldiers awaited their inevitable return to a homeland that no longer existed as they had known it. But in a modest facility outside Camp Crossroads, Nebraska, something entirely unexpected was unfolding. When American officers announced to a group of German women prisoners that arrangements were being made for their repatriation, several of them responded with tears not of joy, but of genuine fear. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the chaotic final months of the European conflict. Young women who had served the Third Reich in various support capacities, now facing a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of their lives. What could possibly transform enemy captives into women who dreaded returning to freedom in their own country? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 7 months earlier, in October of 1944, when the first transport of German women prisoners arrived at the hastily converted facility. Unlike the massive camps housing thousands of male prisoners, this smaller compound held fewer than 70 women, ranging in age from 18 to 32. They had been captured in France as German forces collapsed under Allied pressure, serving as radio operators, medical assistants, and clerical staff for the Wehrmacht. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Reynolds, one of the few senior female officers assigned to manage the facility, remembered her first encounter with the arriving prisoners with crystal clarity. The women climbed down from the olive green transport trucks with expressions that blended defiance, exhaustion, and deep uncertainty. They wore the remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some still displaying the insignia they had once worn with fierce pride. Among them was 23-year-old Greta Schultz, a former communications specialist from Berlin. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, genuinely believing she was contributing to her nation's defense against what she had been taught were barbaric enemies. Now, standing on American soil as a prisoner, she clutched a small black notebook that contained her only remaining connection to the life she had known before. The first days were marked by tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air like fog. The German women kept entirely to themselves, speaking only in hushed conversations during the supervised meal periods. They followed camp regulations with mechanical precision, their faces carefully composed into masks of dignified resignation. Captain Reynolds observed how they maintained their military bearing even in defeat, standing straighter and more rigid than many of her own enlisted personnel. But something began shifting as autumn slowly gave way to the harsh Nebraska winter, and it started with the most unexpected thing imaginable: a sandwich. The women's compound at Camp Crossroads had been constructed in haste during the summer of 1944, when military planners realized they needed separate facilities for the small but growing number of female prisoners being captured in Europe. The camp consisted of 6 wooden barracks arranged around a central yard, surrounded by standard barbed wire fencing and guard towers. Unlike the sprawling male facilities nearby, this compound felt almost intimate in scale, though no less secure. Greta Schultz shared Barrack 3 with 11 other women. The interior was Spartan but clean, with metal frame beds lined up in 2 rows, thin mattresses, and gray wool blankets folded with military precision. A single potbelly stove sat in the center, though it remained unlit during those first October days when the weather still held some warmth. Small windows set high in the walls allowed autumn sunlight to filter through, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The daily routine was established immediately: wake at 600 hours, morning roll call at 6:30, breakfast at 700, followed by work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, and lights out at 2100 hours. The work assignments were simple: maintenance tasks around the compound, laundry duties, and kitchen assistance under constant supervision. Everything was designed to keep the prisoners occupied while awaiting decisions about their ultimate fate. Liesl Fischer, a 20-year-old former nurse's assistant from Munich, had been assigned to the same barrack as Greta, She had fair hair that she kept braided tightly against her head and blue eyes that seemed perpetually worried. During those first nights, Greta could hear Liesel crying softly into her thin pillow, trying to muffle the sound so the other women would not hear. Greta understood. She fought the same urge every night. But her Berlin upbringing had taught her to keep such emotions buried deep inside. The American Guards were a mystery to all of them. The propaganda they had been fed throughout the war had painted Americans as crude, violent people without culture or refinement. Yet the guards at Camp Crossroads seemed almost disappointingly ordinary. They were young men and a few women, most looking barely older than the prisoners themselves. They performed their duties with professional distance, neither cruel nor particularly friendly. They simply existed as part of the strange new reality the German women now inhabited. Marguerite Klein, whom everyone called Margot, was the oldest among them at 28. She had served as an administrative clerk in Hamburg and carried herself with an air of authority that the other women naturally deferred to. During those early days, Margot became their unofficial leader, the one who asked questions of the guards in her careful textbook English, the one who mediated disputes among the prisoners, the one who maintained the discipline and dignity she believed they owed to their uniforms and their homeland. She had no way of knowing that within months, everything she believed about duty, homeland, and dignity would be completely transformed by something as simple as an American lunch. The mess hall was a long, narrow building with rows of wooden tables and benches bolted to the floor. On their first morning at Camp Crossroads, the German women filed in silently, forming a line as directed by the American Guards. They had been warned to expect unfamiliar food, but nothing could have prepared them for what they encountered. Sergeant William Parker, a stocky man in his mid-30s from rural Texas, supervised the kitchen operations. He had volunteered for this assignment despite having no particular sympathy for the enemy. To him, prisoners were prisoners, but they were also human beings who needed to be fed according to military regulations and the Geneva Convention standards. The breakfast consisted of oatmeal, toast with butter, scrambled powdered eggs, and coffee. To American soldiers, this was standard, unremarkable fare, the kind of basic meal served in military facilities across the country. But to the German women, who had been living on increasingly meager rations for months as their country's food supplies dwindled, the portions seemed almost absurdly generous. Greta stared at her tray with genuine confusion. The toast had been spread with real butter, not the ersatz substitutes they had grown accustomed to in Germany. The coffee, though made from grounds rather than the acorn and chicory mixtures that had become common back home, smelled rich and genuine. There was so much food on her tray that she wondered if this was some kind of mistake. Liesel sat beside her, equally bewildered. "Is this actually all for us?" she whispered in German. "Or do we share with others?" Around them, the other women were having similar quiet conversations, unsure of the protocols. Were they expected to eat everything? Was this a test of some kind? Would they be punished if they failed to finish the generous portions? Margot, drawing on her natural leadership, observed the American Guards eating similar meals at a separate table. She noted that they ate casually, without any apparent sense that this food was precious or unusual. This gave her the confidence to pick up her fork and begin eating, and the other women followed her example. The oatmeal was bland but filling. The eggs tasted strange from the powdering process, but they were recognizable as eggs nonetheless. The toast was perhaps the most shocking element. Soft white bread, so different from the dense, dark loaves they had known, spread with butter that was real and creamy. Greta ate slowly, trying to make sense of this abundance. Back in Berlin, before her capture, bread had been rationed strictly. Butter had become a luxury item that most families could afford only occasionally. Yet here, in an enemy prison camp, she was being served these things as if they were ordinary and unremarkable. Something about this simple breakfast began working on her mind in ways she did not yet understand. The disconnect between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing created a strange cognitive dissonance in the minds of the German women prisoners. Throughout their service in the Auxiliary Corps, they had attended regular propaganda sessions emphasizing the superiority of German culture and the degeneracy of their enemies. Americans, they had been told repeatedly, were a mongrel nation without true civilization, people who would treat prisoners with cruelty and contempt. The reality unfolding before them contradicted these teachings in ways both small and profound. By the end of their first week at Camp Crossroads, the women had settled into a wary routine. They performed their assigned tasks with German efficiency, maintaining the discipline and work ethic that had been drilled into them. But they also observed everything around them with careful attention, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught to believe. Private Thomas Chen, a young guard of Chinese-American descent, became an unexpected subject of their confusion. According to their propaganda training, Americans discriminated viciously against anyone who was not white. Yet here was Private Chen, wearing the same uniform as the other guards, treated with equal respect by his colleagues, carrying out his duties with quiet competence. He even seemed to have a gentle nature, often nodding politely to the prisoners as he made his rounds. Greta found herself watching the interactions between the American staff with growing puzzlement. She saw men and women working together without the rigid hierarchical structures she had known in Germany. She observed casual conversations between officers and enlisted personnel that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. The Americans seemed less formal, less concerned with rank and protocol, more interested in simply getting their jobs done efficiently. This informality had been presented to them as evidence of American lack of discipline, but witnessing it firsthand, Greta began to wonder if it might actually represent something else entirely. Perhaps it was a different kind of strength, one based on mutual respect rather than fear. The propaganda had also taught them that Americans were wasteful and gluttonous, consuming resources without thought for others. Yet what Greta observed in the camp suggested something more complex. Yes, the Americans had more food than Germans had seen in years, but they did not flaunt it or deliberately torment their prisoners with displays of abundance. Instead, they simply fed everyone, guards and prisoners alike, from the same kitchen using the same basic ingredients. The portions given to prisoners were smaller than those served to guards, but not dramatically so, and the quality appeared identical. Liesel, who worked alongside American medical staff in the camp infirmary, reported similar observations. The American doctor, Captain Sullivan, treated injured or ill prisoners with the same care he showed to American personnel. He did not perform his duties with resentment or cruelty, but with professional competence and what appeared to be genuine concern for his patients' well-being. Everything they were witnessing contradicted the simple narrative they had been given about who Americans were and how they treated their enemies. This cognitive dissonance was uncomfortable, forcing them to question not just their understanding of Americans, but their trust in everything they had been taught. November brought cold winds sweeping across the Nebraska plains, and with it came the incident that would later seem so significant in retrospect. The kitchen at Camp Crossroads operated on a rotating menu designed to provide adequate nutrition while managing military food supplies efficiently. On a gray Thursday afternoon, Sergeant Parker introduced something new to the lunch service. The German women filed into the mess hall as usual, collected their trays, and found themselves staring at sandwiches made with soft white bread. But these were unlike the plain bread and butter combinations they had received before. Greta picked up her sandwich and examined it carefully. The bread had been cut diagonally, and between the slices was a spread she did not recognize. It was pinkish-brown in color, with a smooth, paste-like texture that had been applied generously. Small pieces of what appeared to be pickle garnished the plate alongside the sandwich. The smell was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Slightly spiced with undertones she could not quite identify. Around her, the other women were conducting similar investigations of their meals, uncertain what they were supposed to do with this strange American food. Liesel leaned close to Greta and whispered in German, "What is this? It looks almost like pâté. Is this what Americans consider prison food?" Margot, sitting across from them, had already taken a cautious bite. Her expression registered surprise, then something approaching pleasure. She chewed thoughtfully before swallowing and announcing quietly to those nearby, "It is some kind of meat spread. Quite flavorful, actually. Not at all what I expected." One of the younger women, emboldened by Margot's approval, raised her hand hesitantly to catch the attention of a passing guard. The guard, a corporal named Sarah Mitchell, who had been assigned to help bridge the language gap, approached their table with professional courtesy. "Yes? Do you have a question?" Margot gestured to her sandwich, searching for the English words. "Please, what is this food called?" "We do not know this." Corporal Mitchell smiled slightly, perhaps amused by the formal politeness of the question. "That is deviled ham. It is a canned meat spread, very common in America. We eat it on sandwiches like this." She paused, noting their continued confusion. "The meat is ham, pork, that has been ground very fine and mixed with spices." The women nodded, processing this information. Deviled ham. The name itself sounded exotic, almost sinful with that word deviled attached to it. But the taste was remarkably good, especially after months of increasingly terrible rations before their capture. Greta took another bite, savoring the flavors. The spread was smooth and rich, salty and slightly spicy, completely different from anything in her experience of German cuisine. The soft American bread complemented it perfectly, and the pickle added a sharp contrast that made the whole combination work. This was prison food. This simple sandwich represented what Americans considered basic, unremarkable fare suitable for feeding enemy prisoners. What did that say about American abundance? What did it reveal about the vast gulf between what they had been told and what was actually true? The deviled ham sandwiches appeared again the following week, and this time the women accepted them without confusion, even with a small measure of anticipation. But it was not just the food that was beginning to change their perceptions. Small acts of unexpected kindness from their American captors were accumulating in ways that made it increasingly difficult to maintain their view of these people as cruel enemies. It started with Private Chen, whose quiet nature had made him less intimidating than some of the other guards. He noticed during his evening rounds that Barrack 3 seemed colder than the others, and without being asked, he arranged for additional coal to be delivered to their stove. When Margot thanked him formally in her careful English, he simply nodded and said it was no trouble, that everyone should be warm enough to sleep properly. Such a small gesture, yet it carried weight, because it was unnecessary, given freely without expectation of gratitude or recognition. Greta witnessed another moment that stayed with her. Liesel had been feeling unwell, fighting off what appeared to be the beginning of a respiratory infection common in the cold Nebraska autumn. During sick call, Dr. Sullivan examined her thoroughly, prescribed medication, and then did something unexpected. He told Corporal Mitchell to ensure that Liesel received extra portions at meals until she recovered fully, explaining that fighting infection required additional nutrition and that he wanted her strength maintained. Liesel reported this to Greta that evening with bewilderment in her voice. "He did not have to do that. I am just a prisoner. But he spoke to me as if I were one of his own soldiers, as if my health actually mattered to him." These accumulating kindnesses created an uncomfortable pressure on the worldview the women had carried with them into captivity. It would have been easier in some ways if their captors had been cruel or indifferent. That would have confirmed everything they had been taught, allowing them to maintain their sense of righteous victimhood. But this casual American decency was far more destabilizing because it demanded they reconsider their fundamental assumptions about who was good and who was evil in this war. Sergeant Parker, the kitchen supervisor, added to this pattern in his own way. He had a teenage daughter back in Texas, and he began to see echoes of her in these young German prisoners. One afternoon, he brought a small radio into the mess hall during dinner preparation and tuned it to a music station. American swing music filled the room, bright and energetic, completely different from the martial music the women had known in Germany. Some of the younger prisoners found their feet tapping involuntarily to the rhythms, then caught themselves and stopped, uncertain whether such responses were permitted or appropriate. Parker noticed and called out in his Texas drawl, enhanced by Corporal Mitchell's translation. "Music is not a crime. You can enjoy it if you want. No harm in that." It was such a small permission, yet it represented something larger. The Americans were not trying to break them or humiliate them. They were simply treating them as human beings who might appreciate small comforts and simple pleasures even in captivity. Winter settled over Nebraska with serious intent, bringing temperatures that made the German women grateful for the coal supplies and warm blankets provided by the camp administration. But the cold weather also brought something else, something that continued to challenge everything they thought they understood about their captors and their situation. The American approach to food during winter months revealed a level of abundance that seemed almost incomprehensible to women who had watched their own country's resources dwindle month by month throughout the war. December meals at Camp Crossroads included items the prisoners had not seen in years. Fresh apples appeared at dinner, not the dried or preserved fruits they had grown accustomed to, but actual crisp apples that crunched when bitten. There were oranges too, citrus fruits that had become impossible luxuries in wartime Germany, but seemed commonplace enough in America that they were given to prisoners without ceremony. Greta held an orange in her hand one evening, feeling its weight and texture, smelling the sharp citrus scent that emerged when she began to peel it. This single piece of fruit represented more abundance than her family back in Berlin had seen in months. The bread continued to astonish them. White, soft, and plentiful, it appeared at every meal without fail. In Germany, bread had become increasingly dark and dense as wheat supplies declined, often mixed with sawdust or other fillers to stretch limited grain supplies. Here, the bread was pure and abundant, spread with real butter or occasionally with jam that tasted of actual fruit rather than artificial sweeteners. Liesel had begun keeping a mental catalog of everything they were given to eat, comparing it to the rations she remembered from her last months in Germany. The comparison was almost absurd in its disparity. Even the coffee, which American soldiers complained about regularly, seemed luxurious to women who had been drinking ersatz substitutes made from roasted grain or acorns. It was real coffee, genuine beans that had been ground and brewed, served hot every morning without fail. The Americans drank it casually, often leaving half cups unfinished, waste that would have been unthinkable in Germany, where every scrap of real coffee was hoarded and treasured. Margot observed all of this with a mind trained in logistics and administration. She understood supply chains and resource management from her work in Hamburg. What she was witnessing at Camp Crossroads told her something profound about American industrial capacity and agricultural output. This was not a special camp receiving unusual allocations. This was standard prisoner of war treatment, the baseline level of provision that Americans considered adequate. If they could feed enemy prisoners this well, while simultaneously supplying millions of troops fighting across two oceans, what did that reveal about the true balance of power in this war? The propaganda had told them that America was weak, dependent on others, unable to sustain a long conflict. Yet here was evidence that America possessed resources on a scale that Germany had never matched, even at its peak. These meals were not just nourishment for their bodies. They were information, data points that forced intelligent women to confront uncomfortable truths about the war they had served and the lies they had been told about their enemies' capabilities and character. December 20th, 1944 brought an unexpected announcement that created considerable anxiety among the German prisoners. Captain Reynolds informed them through Corporal Mitchell that the camp would be organizing a Christmas celebration and that the prisoners were invited to participate if they wished. The invitation itself was confusing. In their understanding, prisoners did not celebrate holidays with their captors. The two groups remained separate, maintaining the clear boundaries between victor and vanquished. Yet here were the Americans suggesting something entirely different, proposing a shared acknowledgement of the holiday season. The women gathered in their barracks that evening to discuss this strange development. Some were suspicious, wondering if this was some kind of test or trap designed to identify those who might be insufficiently resistant to American influence. Others, particularly the younger women, found themselves cautiously excited at the prospect of marking Christmas with something beyond the grim acknowledgement they had expected in captivity. Margot, as usual, took charge of the discussion. She pointed out that refusing the invitation might be seen as hostile or ungrateful, which could damage the relatively comfortable arrangement they had established. Accepting might be viewed as collaboration, but it could also be seen as simply being practical and maintaining good relations with their captors. Greta listened to these debates with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to maintain rigid separation, to preserve her identity as a German woman who had not been corrupted by enemy influence. But another part of her, growing stronger with each passing week, recognized something else. She was desperately homesick. She missed her family with an ache that sometimes made it difficult to breathe. Christmas had always been her favorite time of year, and the thought of spending it in complete bleakness felt almost unbearable. If the Americans were offering even a small measure of holiday comfort, was it really wrong to accept it? The decision was made to participate, though with careful dignity that would demonstrate they were not abandoning their principles. The Americans provided materials for decorations, simple construction paper, scissors, and paste that the women could use to create ornaments. They also offered to allow the prisoners to prepare some traditional German Christmas foods if they wished, provided they worked alongside American kitchen staff and used approved ingredients. Sergeant Parker seemed genuinely enthusiastic about this idea. He was curious about German cooking and saw it as an opportunity to learn something new while giving the prisoners a connection to their traditions. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was transformed. Paper chains in red and green hung from the rafters. Simple stars cut from white paper decorated the walls. A small pine tree had been brought in and stood in the corner, decorated with the ornaments the women had made. The Americans had strung lights on it, and their gentle glow created an atmosphere that felt almost magical despite the barbed wire visible through the windows. The kitchen had prepared a special meal, more elaborate than usual daily fare, including roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread rolls, and even apple pie for dessert. This was abundance on a scale that made several of the younger women cry quietly. January of 1945 arrived with bitter cold and something else that would prove far more chilling than any Nebraska winter. The International Red Cross had been working to maintain communication channels between prisoners of war and their families, operating under the Geneva Convention protocols that governed such matters. Mail service had been sporadic and heavily censored, but it existed, providing thin threads of connection across the vast distances of war. For the German women at Camp Crossroads, letters from home had been rare treasures, read and reread until the paper wore thin from handling. But in early January, something different arrived. Captain Reynolds received a package of German newspapers, delayed by weeks in transit, but finally cleared through military censors and forwarded to the camp. These were not the propaganda sheets produced by Goebbels' ministry, but newspapers from neutral Switzerland that reported on conditions inside Germany with more objectivity. Reynolds debated whether to share them with the prisoners, understanding that the news they contained would be devastating. Ultimately, she decided that the women deserved to know the truth about what was happening to their homeland. Withholding information felt too much like the propaganda tactics their own government had used against them. The newspapers were placed in the small camp library, a room with a few dozen books and some comfortable chairs where prisoners could spend their limited free time. Greta was the first to discover them, drawn by the familiar Gothic script of German language printing. She picked up the top paper, dated from late December, and began to read. What she found in those pages drained the color from her face and made her hands tremble uncontrollably. The reports described Germany in the winter of 1944 as a nation in collapse. Cities were being bombed around the clock by Allied air forces. Civilian casualties were mounting into the hundreds of thousands. Food supplies had deteriorated to near starvation levels in many areas. The infrastructure was crumbling, with transportation networks destroyed and communication systems failing. But it was the personal stories, the small details buried in larger articles, that struck her most painfully. A reference to Hamburg being heavily damaged made her think of Margot's family. News that Berlin had suffered another massive raid made her wonder if her own parents and younger sister were even still alive. The newspapers painted a picture of suffering on a scale that made their comfortable captivity feel almost obscene. Liesel found Greta still sitting with the newspapers an hour later, tears streaming down her face. She sat beside her friend and began reading over her shoulder, and soon she was crying too. Other women discovered them there and joined in this grim reading session. Margot arrived last, having been delayed by a work assignment, and when she saw her fellow prisoners gathered around the German newspapers, she knew immediately that something terrible had happened. She took the papers from Greta's shaking hands and began to read with the analytical mind of someone trained to assess information objectively. The news confirmed what she had begun to suspect from their treatment at the camp and the obvious abundance of American resources. Germany was losing this war badly, perhaps had already lost it in all but the final formal acknowledgement. February brought something worse than news of Germany's military collapse. It brought information that would shatter the very foundation of everything the women had believed about the cause they had served. American newspapers began publishing reports from Allied forces advancing into German territory, and these reports contained accounts of discoveries that seemed too horrific to be real. Captain Reynolds once again faced the difficult decision of whether to share this information with her prisoners. She consulted with Dr. Sullivan and Sergeant Parker, both of whom agreed that the women deserved to know the truth, however painful it might be. The newspapers were placed in the library with a note in German explaining that the contents were disturbing but represented verified reports from multiple sources. Greta approached them with the same dread she had felt reading the earlier papers about Germany's destruction, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found. The articles described concentration camps that Allied soldiers were discovering as they pushed deeper into German territory. Places with names she had never heard before: Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The descriptions detailed systematic murder on an industrial scale, starvation, medical experiments, and cruelty that defied comprehension. The photographs were grainy and unclear, but the accompanying text was precise and damning. These were not isolated incidents or individual acts of cruelty by rogue soldiers. These were organized facilities designed specifically for the purpose of exterminating human beings based on their ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs. And they existed within Germany itself, operated by Germans, part of the same government apparatus that the women had proudly served. Greta felt physically ill as she read. Her hands shook so badly that she could barely hold the newspaper. This could not be real. This had to be propaganda, lies designed to demonize Germany and justify the Allied invasion. But the reports came from multiple sources, included testimony from liberated prisoners, contained details too specific and too consistent to be fabricated. Liesel found her there, just as she had before. But this time Greta was not crying. She sat in frozen silence, her face completely white, staring at the newspaper in her lap without seeing it. Liesel began reading over her shoulder and gasped audibly when she understood what the articles described. "Is this real?" she whispered in German. "Did we serve a government that did these things? Were we part of this?" Other women gathered, drawn by their distress. They passed the newspapers among themselves, reading in horrified silence. Some refused to believe it, insisting it must be Allied propaganda. Others accepted it immediately with a devastation that went beyond words. Margot read every article carefully, her administrative mind analyzing the evidence, cross-referencing details, looking for inconsistencies that might prove it false. She found none. The reports were too detailed, too consistent, too verified by multiple independent sources. This was real. This had happened, and they had served the regime responsible for it. That evening, the German women gathered in the largest barrack without being told to do so. They needed to be together, to try to process what they had learned. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. A few became angry, lashing out at the newspapers as lies designed to break their spirit. The revelation about the concentration camps created a crisis of identity that went far deeper than their military defeat. These women had not been ideological fanatics or committed Nazis. They had been ordinary young women who believed they were serving their country's defense, protecting their homeland from enemies who wanted to destroy Germany. Now they were forced to confront the possibility that everything they had believed about their service, about their country, about their own moral position in the war had been built on lies and propaganda. The question that haunted them most was how much they should have known and when they should have known it. Greta spent sleepless nights trying to remember if there had been signs, hints, and clues she had ignored or rationalized away. Had there been moments when she could have questioned what was happening? Should she have asked more questions about where certain people were disappearing to? She had heard rumors, vague whispers about camps where enemies of the state were sent, but she had assumed they were work camps or detention facilities like any nation might operate during wartime. She had never imagined anything like what the newspapers described. Was that willful ignorance or genuine innocence? Did it even matter? The letters from home that the women had been desperately hoping for became even more critical now. They needed to hear from their families, to know who had survived, to try to understand what had been happening in Germany while they were away serving the military. But the mail service had broken down almost completely as Germany collapsed. Weeks passed with no new letters arriving at Camp Crossroads. The Red Cross tried to maintain communication channels, but the chaos in Germany made it nearly impossible to get messages through reliably. Of the 68 women in the camp, fewer than 20 had received any word from home since Christmas. Greta had heard nothing from her parents or younger sister since November. Liesel knew her mother had been alive in December, but had no information since then. Margot had learned that her apartment building in Hamburg had been destroyed in a bombing raid, but she had no way of knowing if her elderly father had survived or where he might have gone if he had. This uncertainty was torture worse than any physical hardship they endured. The women began to realize they might be returning to nothing. Even if their families had survived, what kind of life awaited them in a devastated Germany? What opportunities would exist for young women who had served in the military of a defeated regime? How would they be treated by their own people, who might see them as failures for having been captured? And most troubling of all, how could they live with the knowledge of what their country had done? Captain Reynolds observed the psychological deterioration of her prisoners with growing concern. She increased Dr. Sullivan's counseling sessions and encouraged the guards to be especially patient and kind. The Americans understood that these women were grappling with something profound, a complete collapse of their worldview and identity. It would have been easy for the guards to gloat or to treat the prisoners with contempt now that the full scope of German atrocities was becoming known. But most of the American staff responded instead with something closer to pity. These were young women who had been lied to and used by their government. April 21, 1945. Captain Reynolds received official orders from the War Department regarding the disposition of German prisoners of war following Germany's inevitable surrender. The orders were clear and detailed, outlining procedures for repatriation that would begin as soon as hostilities formally ended. All prisoners would be processed, documented, and transported back to Europe for release in occupied Germany. The timeline suggested that most prisoners could expect to begin their journey home within 6 to 8 weeks of Germany's surrender. Reynolds knew she needed to inform her prisoners of these plans, but she dreaded the conversation. She called a general assembly for that evening, asking all 68 women to gather in the mess hall. The prisoners filed in with the nervous energy of people who knew something important was about to happen, but had no idea what it might be. They had learned to read the subtle signs in their captor's demeanor, and they could tell that Captain Reynolds seemed more serious than usual, her expression carefully controlled in a way that suggested difficult news. Reynolds stood before them with Corporal Mitchell, ready to translate any complex phrases into German. She held the official documents, but had memorized the key points. "Ladies, I have received official notification from the War Department regarding your status as prisoners of war. As you know, the war in Europe is nearing its conclusion. When Germany formally surrenders, procedures will begin for the repatriation of all prisoners of war to their home countries." She paused, allowing Corporal Mitchell to translate this opening statement. The German women sat very still, their faces reflecting complex emotions that went far beyond simple relief at the prospect of going home. Reynolds continued, reading the relevant portions of the orders. You will be transported to processing centers in Europe, where you will receive medical examinations, be issued appropriate documentation, and then be released into occupied Germany to return to your homes or to locate your families. The words hung in the air with a weight that Reynolds had not fully anticipated. She had expected some level of relief or even joy at this announcement. Instead, she saw what looked like fear on many of the faces before her. Greta felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. They were going back to a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. Back to cities in ruins, families scattered or dead, and a country that would forever carry the stain of the atrocities that had been revealed. They were going back to face the consequences of a war they had lost and crimes they had not committed but had unknowingly served. Liesel reached over and gripped Greta's hand tightly. Her palm was cold and sweating despite the warmth of the crowded room. Around them, other women were having similar physical reactions. Some looked like they might faint. Others sat rigid with shock. A few began crying quietly, though whether from relief or despair was unclear. Margot raised her hand, ever the proper soldier even in this moment. "Captain Reynolds, may I ask a question?" "Of course." Margot. "When approximately will this repatriation begin?" Reynolds consulted her documents. "Assuming Germany surrenders within the next few weeks as expected, we anticipate beginning transport operations in late June or early July. You will have approximately 2 months to prepare." The 2 months between the repatriation announcement and the scheduled departure became a period of intense internal struggle for the German women. On the surface, they continued their daily routines with the same efficiency they had always shown. They worked their assigned duties, attended meals, followed camp regulations, but underneath this facade of normalcy, they were wrestling with questions that kept them awake at night and dominated every quiet conversation. What did they really want? What kind of future awaited them in Germany? And most troubling of all, was it possible that they might actually prefer to remain here in what had been enemy captivity? Greta found herself comparing her life at Camp Crossroads to what she remembered from her last months in Berlin. In Berlin, she had been constantly hungry, worried about Allied bombing raids, surrounded by propaganda that demanded total commitment to a cause she had believed in but never fully understood. Here, despite being a prisoner, she had enough to eat. She felt safe. She had been treated with more dignity and respect than she had sometimes experienced from her own officers in the German military. She had learned things about herself, discovered capabilities and interests she had never known she possessed. The deviled ham sandwiches had become something of a symbol for her, representing the unexpected reality of American abundance and casual generosity. These simple sandwiches, considered unremarkable by Americans, had been her introduction to a worldview completely different from the one she had been taught. They represented a country that could feed even its enemies well, that had resources on a scale Germany had never matched, that approached life with a confidence born from genuine strength rather than desperate propaganda. Was it wrong to want to stay in a place that had treated her better than she had been treated at home? Liesel expressed similar thoughts during their late-night conversations in the barracks. She had been working closely with Dr. Sullivan and had developed genuine respect and affection for the American medical officer. He had taught her things about nursing and patient care that went far beyond her basic training in Germany. He had treated her as a student worth investing in, rather than just a prisoner performing duties. She had begun to imagine a future where she might continue this work, perhaps even become a fully trained nurse in America. But was that betraying her country and her family? Margot, the oldest and most thoughtful of their group, had been conducting her own analysis of their situation. She had always been logical and practical, trained to assess situations based on evidence rather than emotion. The evidence told her several uncomfortable truths. First, they had no reliable information about whether their families had survived. Second, Germany was devastated and would take decades to rebuild. Third, they would likely face discrimination and limited opportunities as former military personnel from a defeated regime. Fourth, the regime they had served had committed atrocities that made her feel complicit simply by association. And fifth, they had been treated better as prisoners in America than they had been as loyal citizens in Germany. What did duty demand in such circumstances? May 15th, 1945 arrived with unusual tension throughout Camp Crossroads. Germany had surrendered a week earlier, and the formal processing for repatriation was scheduled to begin. Captain Reynolds had called another General Assembly to finalize the arrangements and answer any remaining questions. The 68 women gathered in the mess hall, but this time the atmosphere felt different, charged with an energy that Reynolds could not quite identify. She stood before them with her clipboard and official documents, prepared to walk through the logistics of their departure in early July. Before she could begin her prepared remarks, Greta Schultz stood up slowly. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear when she spoke in careful English. "Captain Reynolds, may I speak?" "Permission granted, Greta." Reynolds set down her clipboard, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Greta looked around at her fellow prisoners, receiving small nods of encouragement from several of them. "Captain, some of us have been discussing our situation very seriously for many weeks. We understand that we are to be repatriated to Germany, but we wish to make a request that we know is highly unusual." The room had gone completely silent. Even the guards stopped their usual quiet movements to listen. "We would like to request permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany immediately." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Captain Reynolds felt her carefully prepared speech evaporate from her mind. In all her military experience, she had never heard of prisoners of war requesting to stay in captivity rather than accept freedom and return home. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself momentarily speechless. Liesl stood next, followed by Margot, and then 7 other women. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, a visible representation of those who had made this unprecedented decision. Margot spoke next, her administrative background evident in the organized way she presented their reasoning. "Captain, we understand this request is unusual and perhaps problematic from a legal standpoint, but we ask you to consider our circumstances. Many of us have no confirmed information about our families. We do not know if anyone waits for us in Germany or if we would be returning to nothing." Greta continued where Margot left off, her English more fluent now after months of practice. "More than that, we have learned things here that we never knew before. We have seen how we were lied to by our own government. We have discovered that the Americans we were taught to hate are people who have treated us with more kindness and dignity than we sometimes received at home. We have been given opportunities to work, to learn, to become better people than we were when we arrived here." The implications of what they were requesting began to sink in for everyone in the room. These were not just prisoners asking to delay their departure. They were asking to fundamentally change their status, to somehow remain in America and begin new lives here. The legal complexities alone were staggering. They were still officially enemy nationals, prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protocols. Captain Reynolds sent urgent communications to her superiors in Washington describing the unprecedented situation. The response took 3 agonizing days to arrive, during which the camp existed in a strange state of suspended reality. The women who had requested to stay continued their routines with nervous energy, as if their work performance might influence the decision being made hundreds of miles away. The women who had chosen repatriation treated their departing friends with a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment, unable to fully understand the choice, but respecting it nonetheless. The reply from Washington was characteristically bureaucratic, but surprisingly flexible. Given the extraordinary circumstances of Germany's collapse and the ongoing chaos in occupied territories, the War Department would not force immediate repatriation of prisoners who expressed genuine fear of returning, The 10 women who had requested to stay could be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. However, this reclassification came with significant conditions. They would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the military facility. They would need to find American sponsors willing to vouch for them, secure employment, and demonstrate their ability to support themselves. They would be subject to immigration procedures and restrictions. The announcement created a flurry of activity. The women who had chosen to stay suddenly faced the practical reality of their decision. They needed sponsors, jobs, and places to live in American communities that might not be welcoming to former enemy nationals. The war in the Pacific was still ongoing. American soldiers were still dying, and anti-German sentiment remained strong in many areas. Finding civilians willing to help them would not be easy. But unexpected allies emerged from surprising places. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, a local church volunteer who had been visiting the camp as part of an outreach program, stepped forward immediately. She had become friends with several of the German women over the past months, impressed by their sincerity and their obvious transformation. Mrs. Hoffman, a widow whose own son had been killed fighting in France, made a choice that surprised many in her community. She offered to sponsor Greta Schultz, providing housing and support while Greta sought employment. When friends questioned her decision to help a former enemy, she responded simply that her son had died fighting for American values, and those values included offering redemption to people willing to change. Dr. Sullivan made arrangements for Liesel to continue her medical training at the local hospital in town. He had been impressed by her natural aptitude and careful attention to patient care. He promised to supervise her transition from assistant to certified nurse, vouching for her character despite her German background. His endorsement carried weight in the medical community, and the hospital administrators agreed to accept her into their training program. Sergeant Parker, who had supervised the kitchen where the women had first encountered those transformative deviled ham sandwiches, helped Margot secure a position with a local business. July 7th, 1945 dawned clear and warm across the Nebraska plains. The day that had been circled on calendars for months had finally arrived. The 58 women who had chosen repatriation would be leaving Camp Crossroads, beginning their journey back to a Germany that existed now only as an occupied territory divided among the Allied powers. The scene that unfolded that morning was unlike anything in the history of American prisoner of war operations. Instead of the usual tense formality of defeated enemies being processed for return to their homeland, the atmosphere resembled a community farewell gathering touched with genuine emotion. The departing women had packed their few belongings in standard military duffel bags. They wore clean versions of their German auxiliary uniforms, the same gray outfits they had arrived in months earlier, but somehow they looked different now. The rigid military bearing had softened. Their faces showed less defiance and more uncertainty, but also a kind of quiet strength born from survival and transformation. They carried with them letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, small gifts that had been given by guards and staff members who had become something approaching friends. Captain Reynolds stood before them to deliver remarks she had struggled to write. She had spent hours trying to find words adequate to the complexity of what had happened here over the past 9 months. "You came to us as enemies," she began, her voice steady but carrying genuine emotion. "You leave as something none of us expected when you first arrived. You leave as people we have come to respect. I hope you will carry with you the memory that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that transformation is possible even in the darkest times." Greta, now serving as unofficial spokesperson for the 10 women remaining, stood to respond. She wore civilian clothes donated by Mrs. Hoffman, a simple blue dress that marked her transition from prisoner to displaced person seeking a new life. Her English had become confident and fluent over the months of practice. "Captain Reynolds, we came here believing we understood what America represented. We learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that hatred and ignorance were our true enemies, not the people who captured us. The women who were staying watched their friends board the olive green military trucks that would transport them to the train station, then eventually to ships bound for Europe. Tears flowed freely on both sides, but they were tears mixed with hope rather than pure despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward uncertain futures, but they were journeys chosen with full knowledge rather than simply endured as helpless victims of circumstance. Liesel embraced friends she had lived with for 9 months, women who had shared the transformation from enemy soldiers to something more complex and human. "Write to us," she whispered in German. "Let us know what you find when you reach home." The transition from prisoner to immigrant proved more challenging than any of the 10 women had anticipated. Even with sponsors and promised employment, they faced suspicion and hostility from segments of American society that could not forget they had been enemy nationals. Some businesses refused to hire them. Some neighbors complained about having Germans living in their communities. Local newspapers ran editorials debating whether it was appropriate to allow former enemy personnel to remain in America while the war in the Pacific continued and American soldiers were still dying. But the women persevered with determination born from having already survived worse than social disapproval. Greta found work as a translator for the State Department office that processed displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Her fluency in both German and English made her invaluable in bridging communication gaps. Her unique perspective as someone who had been on both sides of the conflict helped her understand the complex emotions and difficult situations facing the thousands of refugees streaming out of devastated Germany. She lived with Mrs. Hoffman in a small room in the widow's house, paying modest rent from her salary and helping with household duties. The arrangement worked surprisingly well. 2 women from opposing sides of a terrible war, creating a small household based on mutual respect. Liesel completed her nursing certification within 18 months, passing her examinations with high marks that reflected both her natural aptitude and her intense dedication to proving herself worthy of the opportunity she had been given. She secured a position at the hospital where she had trained, working initially in general care before eventually specializing in pediatrics. She discovered she had a particular gift for working with sick children, her gentle manner and patient explanations helping to calm frightened young patients. Her story became locally known, and she was occasionally invited to speak at church groups about forgiveness and transformation. Margot's administrative skills found application in the business world. She worked first as a clerk, then as an office manager, and eventually as an accountant for a manufacturing company. Her German efficiency and attention to detail earned her promotions and respect from colleagues who initially had been skeptical about working with a former enemy national. She never married, channeling her energy instead into her career and into volunteer work, helping other displaced persons navigate the complex process of building new lives in America. The other 7 women who had chosen to stay found their own paths forward. 2 married American soldiers they had met during their imprisonment, creating families that embodied the reconciliation between former enemies. 3 pursued careers in teaching and social work, always carrying with them lessons learned about the power of kindness to overcome hatred. 2 went into business, opening a small restaurant that served both German and American food, creating a literal and symbolic space where different cultures could meet and appreciate each other. 25 years after that unprecedented day when German women prisoners requested to remain in American captivity, Greta Schultz Henderson stood in a university lecture hall in Lincoln, Nebraska. She had been invited to speak to a history class studying post-war reconciliation and the integration of former enemy nationals into American society. Now an American citizen with grown children, she carried with her a small black notebook, the same one she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp Crossroads as a frightened prisoner. The students listened with rapt attention as she described that first encounter with a deviled ham sandwich, how something so simple and unremarkable to Americans had represented a profound revelation to young women who had been taught that their enemies were barbaric and cruel. That sandwich was not just food, she explained. It was information. It told us that everything we had been taught was wrong. It showed us abundance where we expected deprivation, generosity where we expected cruelty, casual kindness where we expected hatred. She spoke about the accumulating small acts of decency from American guards and staff, each one chipping away at the propaganda that had shaped their worldview. She described the devastating moment when they learned about the concentration camps and were forced to confront what their country had done. She explained the impossible choice they faced when repatriation was announced, weighing loyalty to a homeland that no longer existed against the opportunity to build new lives based on better principles. The decision to stay was not about seeking an easy escape from consequences, she told the students. It was about choosing to become better people than we had been. Greta shared updates about her fellow prisoners. Liesel had become Dr. Liesel Fisher, head of pediatrics at a major hospital. Margot had retired after a successful business career and now volunteered helping refugees. The two who had opened a restaurant had created a beloved local institution that served both communities. All of them maintained connections with those who had returned to Germany, creating a network united by shared transformation. Those who went back played crucial roles in rebuilding Germany and strengthening German-American relations. Both groups contributed to reconciliation in different but equally important ways. She concluded by holding up her old notebook. In this, I wrote questions every person must answer. Who am I? What do I believe? What kind of person will I choose to become? America gave me the freedom to discover I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given. It showed me that identity is not just about where you come from, but about who you decide to be. The story of the German women who chose to stay reminds us that even in history's darkest chapters, individuals can write different endings for their own lives. It proves that redemption is possible when societies offer it, and that the most powerful victory over hatred is transforming enemies into friends, prisoners into citizens, despair into hope. Today, their story continues, inspiring new generations, proof that human capacity for growth can overcome even the deepest divisions. They chose to stay, not seeking easy escape, but because they discovered in American captivity something worth defending and sharing. Sometimes transformation begins with something as simple as a sandwich.